I said it earlier, and I'm going to say it again. I'm really happy to be here. And I find today's combination of formats, of vantage points, and radicalisms really engaging and inspiring, to use that slightly awkward word. So let me commence with the short introduction to the next panel. The reason why this session is entitled, and quite melodramatically so, The Transformation of the Self, Art as Alternative Metabolism, is that all of its speakers consider aesthetic forms of production not so much as representations of reality, but rather as something which I would frame as a metabolistic and sometimes even metamorphotic nexus that deviates consciously and very specifically from the intolerable crisis-ridden reproduction of our capitalist present tense. In so doing, their primary task is, it seems, not so much to give way to a critical art or to art as critique, but rather to an engagement with the very modes of production that have given rise to modernity and that still largely determine our understanding of what is real today. And in that sense, I see them as very interconnected with what Rock's Media Collective staged earlier today. One reason for the unabated relevance of the Russian Revolution 100 years after its first appearance is not least that it opened an exit, not so much of, but from modernity. As Frank Engster has observed and as Anke Henning demonstrated earlier today in cinematic form with Mikhail Kalatosov's work, whose name I always mispronounce, the Russian Revolution was not least an ongoingly subaltern revolution, a revolution taking off not within the terms of progress set by the global North's industrialization, but by deviating from it, cutting it off, discarding its central principles, before 1921 at least. If one looks at Russian futurism before and within the revolution, for example, and in the prolet cult, what we witness is not a simple appraisal of the future, but a discontinuation of the present in which the past and the future shoot through the fabric of what presents itself as contemporary reality, demonstrating it as profoundly untimely. It is in this spirit, the spirit of an aesthetic practice that seeks a fundamental disruption of the fabric of the present, that demonstrates the present to be untimely, that this panel will bring together 4 different speakers who present their respective procedures, their workings, their methodologies of proposing an art beyond itself, an art as aesthetic practice. And I speak from art alone here because, sadly, Igor Chubarov had to cancel his participation very last minute due to personal reasons. He, however, sent his paper and a couple of videos and images. So I will be Igor Chubarov for a brief moment, to not let the historical perspective drop out of sight here, which, just as it was the case in the first panel of the Scenes of a Revolution this morning, is the anchor point of our wholeheartedly contemporary discussion. I will, again, present the speakers and their papers in their coming order of appearance, and I will be quick. Chubarov's paper, entitled Nikolai, Evreinov's Revolution in Itself, engages in a new reading, of the famous mass spectacle, The Storming of the Winter Palace, directed by Evreinov in 1920. That is, without any doubt, the most famous production of the prolet cults until this very day. Chubarov discerns the notion of life and theatricality that is central to Evreinov's original philosophy of theatre, that is, that while still retaining the form of an artwork, Evreinov does not produce a representation of the original storming of the Winter Palace, but he produces a live engagement of all its participants with the necessity, the action that is staged, and the necessity of its ongoing actualization. For Evreinov, in Chubarov's perspective, the past is never past. Chubarov was born in Kursk in Russia and studied the history of philosophy at Lomonosov University in Moscow, where he received his PhD on the topic of phenomenological philosophy in Russia and wrote a habilitation on collective sensuality, sadly in Russian. I mean, sadly for me, I don't speak Russian. He was a professor at Moscow State University and as of October this year is the director of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Tyumen, Siberia. He's the editor of the philosophical magazine Logos and a member of the Center of Modern Philosophy and Social Sciences in the Faculty of Philosophy at Moscow State University. He was a fellow of the Center for Literary Research in Berlin and a scholar of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, also in Berlin. Chubarov is the author of works on modern art and early Soviet proletarian art, the history of Russian philosophy, theories of power, the theory of machines, and media theory, and we will miss him greatly in the discussion, but are very happy that we at least have his paper with us. And now they changed, like, the people to my left changed the order, so I have to change the order. No, I will still present you in the old order. So our second speaker, not true, our third speaker, will be the London-based artist Sitzel Meininger-Hansen, who will in her talk introduce her artist practice from a very specific vantage point, in an ongoing collaborative structure named the Cultural Capital Cooperative Object, until now version 1 to 3, which she has been realizing in London, Los Angeles, and Berlin so far. Together with a changing group of other producers, Meininger-Hansen engages actively in the question of expropriating art. A reappropriation of art, to be precise, by its very own producers in an act of shared ownership, of distributed property, of distributed author function, and thus in an aesthetic practice that introduces an artistic metabolism that challenges the distribution as much as the production of what is called contemporary art. In that sense, Meininger-Hansen scrutinizes the exact same nexus which Chubarov discerns in Evreinov's theatrical practice, that of identifying the modern notion of the artwork as an antagonistic stage of a deviant, or rather ongoingly deviating form of shared reality production. Meininger-Hansen produces exhibitions, interdisciplinary seminars and publications that foreground the body and its industrial complex. Her research-led practice takes the form of woodcut prints, sculptures, and CGI animations, often made by combining their own low-tech manual crafts with outsourced, highly skilled digital labor. She co-edited the book Politics of Study in 2015 together with Tom van de Putte, and recent exhibitions include Over at Ludlow 38 in New York, Second Sex War at Gasworks London and Trondheim Art Museum, and No Right Way to Come at Transmission Gallery, all in 2016. And recent seminars include Robot Means Forced Labor, hosted by the Goethe Institute in New York in 2017. Meininger-Hansen's work was presented at the Pavilion for Bosnia and Herzegovina at the 2017 Venice Biennial and in Charlottenburg Kunsthal in Copenhagen. And her show, Cultural Capital Cooperative Object 1 and 2, just like as of last week, closed at Rodeo Gallery in London. Our second speaker on this panel is Johannes Paul Raether. In his contribution entitled Communeering, and I just heard that the word communeering will no longer appear in the presentation, he will give us a parforce tour through the assembled bodies and languages of his performance, personae, who he calls his self-sisters or potential identities. These characters most often appear in theatrical context, but again, like in Evreinov, the understanding of theatricality expands to public space, and given that Raether produces within a capitalist landscape, to corporate space. In their educational realignment of their audiences, Raether's self-sisters propose nothing short of a self-eradication of the artist-author in the process of his communeering. Raether here will present us a model, the repro-techno-tribe of Reproduction's Revolutionary Transformella, which has been under construction since 2010. Johannes Paul Raether lives and works in Berlin. His practice traverses various platforms in performing and visual arts, as well as the humanities, by way of his self-sisters. His works and performances were shown, amongst other places, at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 2017, Transmediale Berlin, the 9th Berlin Biennial 2016, Palais de Tokyo, Fridericianum Kassel, and KW Institute for Contemporary Art in 2013. Recent solo exhibitions include the Kunstverein für Rheinland und Westfalen in Düsseldorf this year, Transmission Gallery Glasgow 2015, and Ludlow 38 in New York 2014. Raether co-edited the book Zeig her für Vor, Tausch ein, Performance Art Academy in 2013, and he received the Villa Romana Prize in 2015. He was artist in residence at Leuphana University's Arts Program 2016, and since then he is also a professor für freie Kunst at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf. Our last speaker on this panel is the New York-based Melanie Gilligan. In her paper entitled A Script in Formation, Imagining Communism, Gilligan will be so generous to speak to us about a working project, an aesthetic practice gaining form, a yet unfinished form of work. Gilligan has furthered working methods and deviant formalisms, and I mean formalism in the most positive sense here, which were already prevalent in earlier work of her, while seeking to give those a different outcome, an outcome that imagines a perforation of art's commitment to the fallacy of the negative image. Gilligan seeks to revolutionize the social process that is film in attempting to tie together different narrations that are, in their combination, willfully untimely. And so again, we're looking at an aesthetic practice refuting the consistency of the present. Melanie Gilligan is an artist living in New York who works in video, performance, text, installation, and music. She graduated from Central St. Martin's in 2002 and studied at the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program between 2004 and 2005. Earlier films of her include The Common Sense of 2014, Popular Unrest of 2012, and Crisis in the Credit System, I think of 2007. Gilligan is represented by Galerie Max Meyer in Düsseldorf, Germany, and her work has been shown, amongst other places, at MoMA PS1, Kölnischer Kunstverein, the Wattis in San Francisco, Trondheim Kunstmuseum, and Casco, Utrecht, to name but a few. Before I hand over the mic to myself, as Igor Chubarov, I would like to note one thing. I know that I have given the artists on this panel a considerably hard time, not only with restricting their presentations to 15 minutes, but also, even more so, in combining this with the wish to not present a classical artist talk, but rather a material reflection in methodology, in structure, to look together at strategies of an art of possible self-abolition of art. I'm very, very grateful that you agreed to think about this format together. And yeah, with those words, I will now move from here to there and read Igor Chubarov's paper. So, could we have the film for a bit? So, Nikolai Evreinov's Revolution in Itself. What you see behind me are the first sequences of the mass spectacle, the storming of the Winter Palace of 1920, directed by Nikolai Evreinov, which still attracts the attention of directors, artists, and researchers, no less than the actual October Revolution. The reason for this state of affairs is something inexplicable about the production itself. Like Evreinov's original philosophy of theater, it presents a clear example of sovereign political action by an intellectual or cultural producer under modern conditions, while still retaining the form of an artwork. Thus, still situated within the boundaries of art, the action permanently underscores those boundaries again and again, gradually capturing territory traditionally belonging to social reality, and re-territorializing the socio-political field and its players in the process. My analysis of Storming of the Winter Palace is based on a radical redefinition of the relationship between theater and life, the constellation of document and production as a means of providing evidence for the impossible event of revolution, expressing the ontological regime of presence and the acceleration mechanism of the messianic time, to quote Walter Benjamin. First part, the lifelikeness of art versus the theatricality of life. Nikolai Evreinov drew upon a great number of examples in his attempt to provide a foundation for the idea of a theatrical instinct of sorts and its primacy with regard to religion, sexuality, art, and theater itself in the narrower sense. He found a source for the most adequate expression of his natural theatricality in the analysis of children at play, in primitive rites, in religious cults. In his view, the theatrical moment played a key role in the emergence of humanity, and it preceded the logic of technical progress and the rational economy of social life. The thesis of total theatricality starkly raises the question of the relation between theatre and life. Shakespeare's famous understanding of all the world as a stage blurs the boundaries of life and art, conflating theatre in a broader sense and theatre as an art in the narrow sense, with its autonomous artistic goals, its immanent artistic form, its own technologies, evolution, and history, etc. One can find an exit from this dilemma in Evreinov's understanding of theatre and art in general as an alternate, potential life, non-identical to our everyday, subordinate to economic and political laws and interests. Theatre is not already life, but it also doesn't exceed its bounds. It is neither part nor reflection. It is an alternative, but not for the notion of life, and not in favor of some dream or utopia. The theatre is an alternate model of social life, which is itself theatrical to the core, but obeys the will and taste of its talentless political directors by inertia. According to Evreinov, it is not life that should become theatre, but theatre that should become life. Its authors and actors should become aware of their actions as expressions of vital theatrical instinct or a form of life presupposing its own theatrical transformation. Here it makes sense to compare Evreinov's idea with the image of the theatre in Walter Benjamin's famous essay on Kafka. And I quote, "Kafka's world is a world theatre. For him, man is on the stage from the very beginning. The proof of the pudding is the fact that everyone is except by the nature theatre of Oklahoma." What the standards for admission are cannot be determined. Dramatic talent, the most obvious criterion, seems to be of no importance. But this can be expressed in another way. All that is expected of the applicants is the ability to play themselves. It is no longer with the realm of possibility that they could, if necessary, be what they claim to be. The law of this theatre is contained in a sentence tucked away in a report to an academy. And I quote Benjamin quoting Kafka. "I imitated people because I was looking for a way out, and for no other reason." End quote. In that sense, from the Benjaminian, Ephronavian, Kafkaian viewpoint, it is not enough to look at the surrounding world as theatre. One has to play with it, unmasking the pretensions of the state and its institutions to supply social reality with a methodological frame. If one projects Evreinov's theatre of theatre onto this mass spectacle, the storming of the Winter Palace, in this context, one can assume that his staging of the revolution was not intended as aesthetic entertainment. That is, it did not pursue the cathartic effect of purifying the passions or re-experiencing a collective trauma for its former participants and belated spectators. Instead, it meant to supply an original experience of revolutionary play as such, aimed at the past. As Sylvia Sasse has written in her study on confessions in Russian culture, and I quote, "Unlike Marino and Freud, Evreinov's drama therapy is not based on a secondary experience of insurmountable problems that we play out, but is attained solely through the possibility of transformation, through theatrical play based on the ludic drive. End quote. That would mean that its intended cathartic effect concerns the revolution of 1917 itself, but rather the historical conditions that fostered its occurrence, the insurmountable contradictions of social life in the past. In that sense, Evreinov's theatre of revolution in itself opposed the naturalistic theatre of the revolution of 1917 in itself by engaging in a collective transgression, part of which was giving in to theatrical instincts from whom the audience was alienated in naturalistic theatre and whose indulgence had to be punished. On the contrary, in Sasse's view, Evreinov's production intended to purify passive catharsis from the sham re-experiencing of the revolution. Its collective therapeutic effect here was rather a result of the equal participation of all authors, actors, and audience in an original revolutionary action. And maybe we can turn from the film to the PowerPoint he sent. Okay. The substitution of a retouched photo of Evreinov's staging, later canonized in the Soviet mass media as a genuine photo of the storming of the Winter Palace in 1917, which we see here, appears as an irony of history, which Sylvia Sasse suspects to a subtle analysis of the book Nikolai, Evreinov and Others, The Storming of the Winter Palace. This leads us to understand that it doesn't matter whether the revolution of 1917 was an actual event manifesting the will of the working masses in compliance with the laws of history, or just a spectacle played out by a little group of revolutionaries, a conspiracy of Bolsheviks, Jewish Masons, and the German government. The real question is whether revolution is at all possible as an event in the form of an artistic gesture transforming a violent reality. And I quote, "For Evreinov, by virtue of its transformative power, theatre or theatricality can induce experiences and evoke emotions that are just as real as those one could have had when living through a historical event." Evreinov believes in the reality-producing effects of theatre, a theatre that does not need to worry about whether it correctly depicts reality. For Evreinov, showing reality does not mean referring to reality. Rather, it means creating the real through theatre. The question is, what kind of real is created through such theatre? Which emotions does it tap? Which events does it provoke? To answer the question, we might refer to Benjamin's understanding of history, not as humanity's linear progress through homogeneous, empty time from the past to the future via the present, but as a constant return to the unsolvable events of the past, collective catastrophes of violence, with the goal of quoting and saving them from falsehood and oblivion in the present. If one looks at Evreinov's staging of this retrospect, the opposition of pageant spectacle that so vexed the theatre theoreticians of the 1920s automatically falls away. And it appears as a near-ritual commemoration, a melancholic acting out of what was repressed and forgotten about the revolution of 1917, namely its failure. Such a strategy might help to get beyond the myth of revolution as some kind of Groundhog Day for later Soviet generations, and to understand that revolution becomes an event only through a playful engagement with its non-realization in the past. That is, with the social conditions that provoked it, soon to be reproduced in the post-revolutionary period. When real artists turn to the revolution, it is never just to remember what has transpired, but to fan the ashes of mythological violence, René Girard, to raise the spirits of the innocent victims, to turn to the past as something unsolved and unredeemed. The failure of any revolution, its unfulfilledness, is connected to its rejection of the past, its unjust nullification in the interest of a modernity unable to recognize itself as intended in the image of the past, as Walter Benjamin put it. In this context, Evreinov's staging can be understood as a model for the great theatre of Petersburg, producing images and gestures capable of isolating and halting the spread of revenge and violence in society. So to conclude, the necessity of turning to theatricality as a mask of sorts, and in the final analysis to the development of artistic forms on the body of society itself, is connected to the situation of indistinguishability between ordinary crimes forms of state terror, and manifestations of intense revolutionary desire in the contemporary world. For better or for worse, we do not live in primordial society or in children's dreams, but in the world of high-tech simulacra and cynical ideologies. We know the law and derive pleasure from its transgression. This is why the theatrical mask presents a reflexive instrument of sorts, allowing us to control and suspend the subjectivity formed by society beyond our will, maintaining the distance of the subject's non-identity with itself. In other words, today it is only fully possible to expand upon the intensity of desire in an artistic form on the stage of art. And the theatre presents a privileged stage where one can encounter power on a field that is not its own, and where one can play by rules other than its own. But this is a game played with power itself, not with its hired actors, policemen, politicians, members of the military, and so on. Giorgio Agamben writes of something similar, and I quote, "It is the sort of use that Benjamin must have had in mind when he wrote of Kafka's The New Attorney, that the law that is no longer applied but only studied is the gate to justice. Just as the religio that is played with but no longer observed opens the gate to use, so the powers of economic law and politics deactivated in play can become the gateways to a new happiness." End quote. The possibility of reaching the sought-for result is linked to a subtle circumvention of the alliance between society and the state. The artist does not attack society with direct physical violence, and society does not turn to the services of the repressive state apparatus to tame him or her. The artist practices an innocent deception of society. People believe that they have come to the theatre or to an exhibition as spectator. But they are turned into something like an ancient green choir, full-fledged participants of a tragedy unfolding. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name, as it was said before, and it's written in the program, is Johannes Paul Raether. That name is real. But as a sign for my body, it's just one identifier for a multiplicity of other constructed bodies that are entangled with this body. I am also transformella. I, as her, gestate the common coming repro-techno tribe, as the mother of surrogate futures, as the repro-revolutionary of ovolu factories. Think of my body enmeshed, entangled with transformalor, with this creature, the repro-mother's fork, an IKEA super reproducer. I am not me alone, I am protectorama, worldwide witch, and smartphone Sangoma. I am as Protector XX, communeer of witch machines, rare earth occultist, and techno-alchemical being. I am the being of a swarm. I am Schwarmwesen. I, as us, research and write, as a herd. We call ourselves self-sisters, avataras, or potential identities. Others name us ridiculous tricksters, idiots, and traitors of identity and gender, family and nation, traitors of what they call this reality, or common reality. I, as we, on the contrary, work towards the notion that common reality and the etymological core of common is mean, that reality, which is mean as it's insufficient, must be betrayed. for the potential, for a potential of another real, the potential of an unredeemed real that is embedded in the common. So we do not come from another world, nor do we come from another time. We sort of function as vessels into our own constructed, into our potential realities. And while we embody them in the here, the common, the mean, the now. So I, as us, produce potentiality against reality. For that purpose, all of us, as me, exist as a string of appearances along we continue to grow. Think of it as an alternative lifeline to this body. I, as us, is a series of acts in various spaces, an ongoing thread of interventions, infiltrations, rituals, hikes, walks, and workings. Imagine our potentiality, the order of beings, as an identitecture. Identitecture is a constructed, continuously evolving genealogical tree of me, as an experimentally and technorganically sprawling herd. Imagine it as a diagram of my as our reality construction and the evolving organigram of multiple identities. Through it, we understand my as our process of manufacturing identities, the process of how we, each of us, embody a set of questions, a field of research, a lifeline. So my body becomes a narrative of partitioning, of reproducing me as ourselves, as proxies, as proxy-identities. What I just read in this first form is how I usually start a report on all of me. Normally I would now start to give these bodies not only names and attach images to them. Usually I would add concrete practices, anecdotes, and memories of these beings. But for this panel, Kerstin already said, she asked us to focus on methods, on models, and on concept. And so I will try to narrate them not through their acts and through their memory of that acts and the history, the oral history that I'm producing normally around them, but through their concepts first, through their language. And I will focus on two word forms, two instances of language making. The first one is a grammatical construction, a compound noun, if you want, which is a paradox in itself. And the second one is a self-invented term, a neologism. Both of them I have developed in the last years, and I dragged them into many of these appearances that you just saw, dragged them into I as us, as a practice. They are extracts. I extract them from these growing bodies, and they are examples, of course. They have to remain examples, and that's why communeering, which is so fitting, kind of evaporated in the process, because it's one of these terms that's really connected to these bodies evolving and in practice, and this is about concepts and about a model, and that's why I chose to get rid of it. I hope they will be suitable for also a wider discussion, but obviously, since they are neologisms, they tend to be a bit hermetic. Let's see if it kind of works in that sense. I as us is an invented pronoun, a compound pronoun, and I said it's a paradox. And I would go as far as saying it's an identitarian paradox that takes my constructed identity disorder serious as an act of speech, and it at the same time hopefully represents it as a method. The method of speaking as. It's of course a common performance practice, and it's sort of the essential instance of performing arts, but I aim to take it into various other realms, like the discursive realm of a concert such as this one, which kind of explains the form I presented earlier, this performative versing, singing of my own identity. So I tried to take it not only into the realm of performing arts on the stage, but into the discursive, into conferences, but most importantly to public space, and as Kerstin has mentioned, to corporate spaces. It's also going to the university, and what I think is important to note about all of these spaces is that they have their own very specific ways and are very firmly bound to jargons der Eigentlichkeit. I say this in German, jargons der Eigentlichkeit. It's a concept I borrow from Adorno, and I'm sort of tweaking it a little bit. Jargons of authenticity. I'm trying to liquefy the boundaries of what is I and what is us, not by the means of a group, a company, or a collective, but as a continuous production of disturbances for my name, for my appearance, and therefore for my very identity. I'm asking myself as a subject, what's authentic about me, and what is a narrative? What is a contention and what is an attribution? What is the specific societal, personal, what's the communal within my subject construction? And by all of this, I hope to develop another jargon, eine spezifische Sprache der Uneigentlichkeit, a language of inauthenticity, which I think is not only aesthetically important, but I hope politically, and the second term will explain why. Reprovolution is evolving within the lifeline of Transformella and Transformalor. While they research the processes in which biodigital capitalism transforms the way we reproduce things and beings, the means by which we procreate ourselves and the species. Within these questions, their, Transformella and Transformalor's focus is the merging of biotechnological industries such as surrogacy centers, cryotechnologies, and egg cell markets with global communication and transport networks. As an example of this, we have been talking about surrogacy centers in India since 2011. These surrogacy centers are in the business of breeding humans for a group of global customers that demand their genetic material to be implanted into poor women in order to have their own genetic progeny gestated, born, or if you want, biologically produced. It is because various technologies merge and melt into one another, creating a new mutation of reality from various formerly separated realities, that I propose a mutant term that also melts historical materialist terminology such as reproduction and revolution into one another. So reprovolution or reprovolution is a moment in time and a practice against that moment. It is the present moment in which we as a species start to not only shape populations by means of biopolitical or necropolitical management, but we as humans have started to assemble biological processes as global production chains that put us as humans in control of our own reproduction of the species in and for itself. It's a lot of circles, but it's important. Unfortunately, this all happens according to the principles of capital. And within this imminent moment of capitalist reprovolution, I, as Transformalor, aim to construct a psychotic and at the same time realist communal structure against capitalist reprovolution. The group of authentic and non-authentic subjects constituting this structure is what we call a repro-techno tribe. It's a communal and techno-socially engineered substitution for the nuclear Fordist and for the modernist biological family. The tribe is situated both in the moment of reprovolution and is in itself, as a construction, as a social construction, a reprovolutionary subject. So I would argue that if we keep speaking as natural humans on the topic of an artificial reproduction changing the way we have children, and I'm sort of quoting the general assumption of how we should talk about this, we fail to grasp the fundamental categorical rift that is implied in this mutant term of reprovolution. Reprovolution is not a revolution within a state or a political system. It is the techno-biological assembly line that produces the human as a biological artifact and therefore collapses or melts the idea of the human and the non-human into one another. For me, to speak as a constructed being is a way to embody the idea that as capitalist biological artifacts, we as a species are producing ourselves as non-humans. And while we do not have a notion of what we will have become, it seems we do not have much time left. We do not have too much time left to be speaking as humans. To remain human, however, is to organize the communal on a planetary scale against the rise of all the mythic techno-organic creatures that our collective fantasy has come up with. Our capitalist self-reproduction realizes the cyborg, but also the ancient chimera. It renders the zombie actual as much as the artificial intelligence silicon-based being, the vampire, the hydra, the autonomous drone. They all become reality. Thank you. That's as much as I want to say.
I'm a filmmaker. I'm just going to start reading to you from this, and if there are questions after, so anyone wants more clarity about what I do, you should definitely ask me. It's lovely to be invited here today to talk about communism. This is an invitation that happens to come at a moment when I was contemplating making a depiction of communism in a new film that I'd like to make. In this talk, I'll try to set down some of the thinking which is at the very first stages. However, the first thing that occurs to me when I begin thinking about this is that I'm faced with the reality that is the intolerable current reality of fascism as it spreads in the global north. The horror of the present conditions bars one from simply imagining a world that is preferable to the present. The image of a possible near better future is blocked by the fact of racist violence. There's so many questions facing people right now. What will the collective response be to each new racist state policy, each formal and informal mode of social control? What new forms of struggle will emerge as the fascist grip tightens? As each new far-right rally or far-right political victory emerges, or racist police killing is perpetrated, as each racist state policy is enacted and immigration raids and border controls follow, as groups are socially excluded and people of color are marginalized in schools, workplaces, and across the social sphere, as they face hate crimes, violent murders, and many other forms of effectively state-sanctioned violence, the possibility of imagining another society recedes from view. But then, on the other hand, it becomes more urgent to be able to imagine another reality. In this context, it is hard to see how what has not been made possible by past attempts at communism might come to happen today. that communism is raised here in this program of events as a possible challenge to the racist state violence and economic exploitation in people's daily lives is a positive development. That those fights connect to a broader vision of a just or better society is very important as well. However, as I say, the reigning political landscape is frightening and is hard for me to just speak about communism. Contemplating this in the light of our discussion has caused me to imagine a very odd type of film plot, something I'm working on, considering working on, but maybe will decide not to make, one film in which communism and fascism are two antagonistic orders of reality that define a world, but are somehow both present in that world, but never at once, in swift succession, one after another instead. All conventional film scripts are said to need conflict. The conflict that I'm imagining here is created not from the dynamics of character relationships as one normally finds in a contemporary film or television drama. Rather, the structural conceit that I just described would literalize the present emergence of fascism as a set of political oppositions that are too corrosive to sustain one reality. These oppositions push reality into a temporal and spatial disconnection that separates one world from the other. The story abruptly shifts between these two worlds, where there is a movement toward a communist horizon of possibility, and then suddenly we're dropped into a terrifying capitalist present in which fascism reigns. Characters would live fragments of lives in a fascist world, in which travel bans are imposed, people of color of all backgrounds are treated as if they don't belong, are constructed as threats to be criminalized, deported, and are not given access to legal systems, the same wages, while other situations, sometimes for the same people, in other situations, they're told that they cannot control their bodies, their sexuality, their gender, that access to the built-in social environment is not theirs. Then, suddenly, unexpectedly, the same characters are dropped into moments of communism, a type of communism that I should explain is a set of possibilities distinct from earlier existing political systems. Systems that were previously called communism. These were not proletarian revolutions in the Marxist sense, preserving capitalism, and the value form as a social relationship in variations on state-run capitalism. So instead, what I'm talking about is a society run entirely collectively and without exchange, in which collective life takes shape through a process of struggle against forces we do not have time to imagine here today, but which might structure some of the narrative shown in this world, in this film. What's interesting for me about this scenario that I'm recounting is that it looks directly at the current moment when the deterioration of social conditions has brought about a questioning of capitalism in some respects, in some spheres, but in parallel, a condition in which the outcomes of long-standing racism, racist histories, and racial resentments in Europe and North America have led to devastating racist, xenophobic and nationalist elections and referendums. If the films I make could sometimes be said to present theoretical and political problems, it has been useful in the past to present those ideas in essays and public discussions, such as this one we're having now, before the films are made, in order to test and develop those ideas. However, at this very early moment of the process of filmmaking, I do not know if this film will be realized at all. It's more of just like a thought problem in its kind of very earliest sort of stages. It may simply be problems to think through, starting with questions such as, what does it mean to speak about communism when we're faced with the present situation? So to answer that question, I'll lay out some of the ideas for the film as they currently stand. People who've encountered my work before may recognize that because of my own political affinities, I'm partial to collective narratives involving multiple characters. I don't focus on the stories of individuals alone, but I put these narratives in contact with many others and with depictions of larger scale and economic dynamics. I'm aware, however, that in the present moment, much of the racist and nationalist discourse and policies being pursued by conservative and far-right governments scapegoat individuals based on aspects such as immigration and citizenship status and positions within labor markets, among other things. So it seems essential, then, that a project that engages specific forms of domination in the present relate to multiple systemic forms of oppression. Multiple systemic forms of oppression that vary between people's specific situations, whether this be a relationship to economic markets, state violence, or other parallel forms of domination. And so a film that I would like to attempt seems to need a conceptual framework to look at these. I've been searching for such a model, and it's led me to a strange combination of this kind of dry and hoary Marxiological theory and highly mainstream pop culture, or pop cultural products, in a way. So I'll begin with the Marxist side. The Marxist concept that I've been looking at is a political and aesthetic one, and I've been also looking at the tensions that rest within it. This concept, totality, as I'm using it, is a way of thinking the sum of capitalist social relations as the constitution of a whole, a kind of whole, one which has endlessly complex and contradictory internal correspondences and permutations. Most prominently appearing in Hegel and Marx, and also in philosopher Georg Lukács, the concept of totality for Lukács, as interpreted by Frederick Jameson in his essay History and Class Consciousness and An Unfinished Project, can be related to narrative as a push to overcome the epistemological confines of immediate individual experience, and instead suggests the effects of a whole range of social and historical forces exerted on that perspective. In the context of this discussion, Jameson describes totality as partly a method of defamiliarizing the individual as the vantage point of aesthetic work, instead focusing on interrelationship of people and their social and political dynamics. This is a quality that I find relatively absent from Western narratives, be they novels or Hollywood films. Generally, they focus on individual stories, on individual sort of sets of realities. However, my interest, the concept of totality has often been charged with eliding differences by assuming a totalizing picture of society, identified historically with an emphasis on the worker as subject. However, my interest in this theme comes in part from Jameson and the more recent work of Kevin Floyd in the service of queer theory, which frames the concept in terms of a multivalent complexity of social relations, in which specific material constraints and structural conditions delimit different people and groups within capitalism. For myself, I've thought about the concept as a method to reinterpret a set of narrative conventions in certain films in such a way as to open up their political and conceptual dynamics for thinking the irreducible difference, and that was Jameson, in various experiences of constraint, again, Jameson's term there, so that was various experiences of constraint within capitalism. Jameson discusses the charge of totality's workerist emphasis, whose historical position in Western labor movements we know is that of the white male, able-bodied and heterosexual working class. And he considers how the theory of totality opens a space for the epistemological priority of the experience of various groups and collectivities, For instance, he primarily discusses this in relation to the struggles of women and people of color, pointing out their meaning for the new social movements of the 1960s and 70s, which involved anti-colonial, black power, feminist, and queer political movements. Questions and individuals face, Groups and individuals face very distinct and specific forms of structural constraints within capitalism, and the notion of an unpresentable whole of capitalist social relations in which one engages moments of domination and exploitation shaped by particularities of gender, racialization, ethnicity, sexuality, illness, and disability. The last three I just mentioned being positions that affect me specifically. This particular framework helps me to partially determine, to bring this into focus as fragmented but coalescent perspectives that only ever determine a part of one's epistemic position. Totality in this case as a method for filmmaking can be a mode of putting different lived conditions and experiential realities into arrangement in relation to each other as part of a historical and social conditions where they can be made explicitly to speak to one another. With this in mind, I've studied a series of well-known films from the 1990s and 2000s, such as Shortcuts and Magnolia, which form multiple unconnected stories, often set in Los Angeles. Most of the ones I've been looking at have been set in Los Angeles, that may pass each other, where the stories where people may pass each other randomly or never intersect in emptied out but overlapping arbitrary story landscapes, eventually revealing some mode of connection to one another. Jokingly, I've been calling these totality films. I see how this style of film offers an indirect roadmap of sorts through Hollywood corniness into a possible unmarked terrain for thinking difference and complexity in the present. In various permutations, as meaningless encounters, as in Robert Altman's Shortcuts, connected social phenomena such as in Steven Soderbergh's Traffic, or The Wire by David Simon, or by thematizing the idea of random convergences revealing a hidden order in Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, the totality film confronts the arbitrary quality of separate and divergent stories by producing some sense of correlation from them. And for the purpose of my interests, this idea of producing a concerted social and political analysis from these structures, whether they be economies or various forms of social systems that undergird the fabric of people's lives, that's incredibly interesting. It's almost like a mode already supplied in the style or something. So what would I do with that as a person making a film? So such an idea of cohesion does not exist in everyday life, but may be visible from two constructed perspectives, two constructed vantage points. The first being the imagined bird's eye view in which one can understand capitalism as a whole system, or as fragments of a system, but also that we kind of understand, kind of envelops most of the reality that people on this earth are exposed to. This conceptual and theoretical construction that sees it all come together as one picture is discernible in patterns and social structures, is familiar in a second example. So I gave one example of something that brings things together, and here's a second one. That would be the sense of connection which is often affected in film and television, the sudden bringing things into some alignment through modes of editing, styles of writing and determining the structure of the film. Therefore, the idea of political filmmaking may be productively developed through the articulation of multiple nonlinear strands of fiction, for instance, in depicting a political situation such as an anti-racist or anti-capitalist protest, as constructed alignments between characters and stories. When one moves beyond narratives of individuals to those of many people or groups, one has to find modes of collective telling for depicting and commenting on social struggle and negotiating new subject matter that exist somewhere between aesthetic and political positions. To return to my previous discussion of this scenario between communism and fascism, then, what does this have to do with the idea of totality? Or the films I'm talking about? The story that I'm discussing heightens desires and fears, as in any normal Hollywood drama, as people in the fascist world, not separable from their context, feed their hatred, scapegoat the marginalized, cover up new vulnerabilities, racial, economic, or otherwise, through continuous racist anger, and trauma wears away previously held forms of solidarity, underlying violences that arise over and over to replace them with anxiety and bigotry. The other world of communism I'm cautious to fully imagine is kind of very much also in formation as all of this. One thing I do see is that people are smart enough to decide how they want to live and be able to organize it collectively, completely collectively, without necessarily the involvement of parties or state, though that, of course, is a very long conversation. Thank you. That struggle would be an upward battle, not toward a higher level of abstraction, but rather a dynamic attuned to social movements and political convergences, not accumulation, would decide new orderings of time, materials, and space. The experience of struggles of others would be explicitly politicized, but not have to be fixed and classified, as they are open to social and collective construction. Often narratives in this world do not converge without capital as a major means of connectedness, while others ricochet against each other, pulling through a chance intersections and hidden structures, and hidden structural logics arranged in urban and rural environments. As the imagined story veers from one reality to the other, one thing that guides it would be the lives of multiple characters whose relationships and subject positions of constraint are each treated extremely differently in the two separate realities of fascism and communism. The plot would unfold a personal and structural social conditions that are treated wholly differently in these two societies. As you can tell, this film plot is shaped by the opposed political conditions of the present moment, where our world of extremes has broken apart and cannot hold all of its own trajectories all at once. Those of racist hatred, structural violence, xenophobia, nationalism, economic competition and immiseration, exploitation and domination, and in the lives of some people, the hope that it can still all be stopped. Caution comes in to stall me in developing my plot any further, though. As I say, this story may never leave the page. My question then is, will the characters in this imagined film experience, be suddenly thrown between worlds? What does it mean if the people in that world, or for that matter, in our own world, carry on as before as these terrifying changes happen around them? What happens if they or we do not take steps to stop them? And then I finish my paper.
Have a lovely evening. And thank you again to the three of you.